Chicago's 47th ward, former candidate for governor, and first Asian and Indian American elected to the Chicago City Council in major office in Illinois. While in office, Ameya focused legislative efforts around social justice, worker rights, and economic justice. To this end, Ameya led most labor policy and worker rights legislation passed in Chicago over the last 8 years, including raising the minimum wage to $13 an hour, guaranteeing paid sick leave, combating wage theft, and preserving housing for Chicago's most vulnerable. Most recently, he was named a 2018 McCormick Foundation Executive Fellow. Prior to leaving office, Ameya chaired the Chicago Resilient Families Task Force. The task force made recommendations on city-run basic income pilot, the expansion and modernization of the EITC, and the need for narrative change public policy. Daniel Biss is a senior fellow at Americans for Financial Reform, a nonpartisan and non-profit coalition of more than 200 civil rights, consumer, labor, business, investor, faith-based, and civic and community groups. Formed in the wake of the 2008 crisis, they are working to lay foundation for a strong, stable, and ethical financial system, one that serves the economy and the nation as a whole. He is a former Illinois State Senator and candidate for governor of Illinois. Biss earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Harvard University in 1998 and a PhD in mathematics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2002. His experience includes work as a professor at the University of Chicago and as a policy advisor for former Illinois Governor Pat Quinn before serving in the Illinois General Assembly. Some of his campaign themes during the 2018 gubernatorial race were fixing the budget and creating an Illinois where everyone can prosper, tax reform, expanding workers' rights, paid family leave, leveling the playing field, healthcare as a universal right, and adhering to international climate regulations, among other themes. Welcome.
Thanks. Do you want me to show the clip?
Oh, shoot, yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Sorry.
we invited them to our October meeting to speak about their new initiative to combat the activist investments by the billionaires with activists investing with the public money in the state of Illinois. And then we also asked them to share, I guess, some tips with us, since some of us are PCs, we're all engaged in politics, working with candidates, how to talk about the fair tax, which is going to be a really, I think it's expected to drive record turnout at the November election. And so anyway, I have a clip, it's about 2.5 minutes from WCIA. Susanna Mendoza, our comptroller, was being interviewed by a reporter in Springfield about this case. It's the Warlander case. Yeah.
In a high-stakes lawsuit now before the 4th District Court of Appeals, John Sullivan and a New York hedge fund are challenging $14 billion of state debt. 400 asset bills have been adopted.
Okay, well, I tried. I thought that.
So these hedge fund managers, they are gobbling up the state's debt.
At the peak of the budget process, states were estimating at close to 10 years old funds as comptroller Sullivan said wealthy investors to retire yields on Illinois debt. She suspects ulterior motives.
Okay. I think we'll just let you explain that. For some reason, that wasn't working the way we thought it would. So we do have a mic if you would care to use it.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us. It's lovely to be back here. I fondly remember a visit to this room, actually, I want to say in February or maybe even early March of 2018, which was a lovely evening. But I have perhaps even fonder, more recent memory in this building, which was, I believe, the day before Election Day in November of 2018, when the early voting lines were just utterly insane because of the work that you and others have done here. And then to see those lines and to see those election returns and to see a bunch of people running credible campaigns for countywide office in DuPage County, running to defeat Grant Worley at long last. It's very exciting, and it's really impressive, the work that y'all have done, and I just want to thank you for giving us a chance to be a part of it. I think the way we're going to structure this is I'll give a few quick introductory remarks, and then Ameya will dig in, I think, in quite a bit more detail on this question and the question of the investment kind of opportunity that I think we have to use, kind of pick up a tool that's lying around and not really being used to do some good work. And then when that conversation's kind of played itself out, then I'll kind of tag back in and talk some about the fair tax. And would love to kind of get a sense of what experience PCs have had already and what pushback and what we might want to workshop some responses to. But this video is about a genuinely shocking situation, which is that, you know, nowadays in the financial sector, you can place a bet on anything, right? You don't just buy a stock because you think the company is going to do well and you want to invest in it, though you can do that too. You can place all kinds of esoteric, elaborate bets, and in particular, you can bet on a state government defaulting on its debt. So that's already kind of, I don't know. Think about the purpose of the financial market. It's supposed to be to drive investment to valuable opportunities to better human life. You can believe in that or not believe in that, but placing a bet on a state government defaulting on its debt is really neither here nor there, I would argue. But anyway, that's the rules. You can place a bet, and a hedge fund, in fact, placed a giant bet on that very question, betting that Illinois would default on its debt. But they weren't content to just make the bet. They decided to first make the bet and then make it come true, right? This is like when the arsonist first takes out a fire insurance policy on the house they're about to burn down. So they went to court to try to essentially have a court force the state of Illinois to default on its debt. The lawsuit is preposterous enough that they've not met with any meaningful success so far, and I think we're cautiously hopeful that they're not going to. But it's an indication of the philosophy that some market actors have about what their job is. Their job is not just to kind of quietly invest in a place that they think is going to pay off. Their job is to first make an investment and then go and try to manipulate the markets to play out in their favor. And in this particular instance, the thing they were trying to manipulate the markets to do would have been devastatingly harmful to the entire state of Illinois, not just for a little while, but I would say quite literally for generations. So you can get mad about this. We did that already, but you're welcome to join us. You can think about federal policy change to better and more appropriately regulate predatory market behavior, and it's part of what I do in my kind of day job at the Americans for Financial Reform. But we also wanted to make the point that instead of just fighting against something, we can view the government as an entity that has the ability to be an activist investor for the cause of good. So we hear a lot in Illinois about our pension funds and how they don't have enough money, which is true, unfortunately. We've got to fix that over time. But one thing that we don't talk about is that even though we don't have enough money in our pension funds, we have many tens of billions of dollars in those pension funds. Many tens of billions of dollars. And those dollars are, with very tiny exceptions, invested only based upon some kind of abstract financial theory about where the greatest return is going to come. And listen, there's an argument for that, right? We need to be able to pay out the pensions we've promised people. We have the money put aside to enable us to do that. And so the money is invested then even to bring back greater return and make it even more plausible to make those pension payments. But the point that is sort of our jumping off point is, now wait a second, the Illinois budget is like close to $40 billion, and we just heard a discussion about the effort to pass the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which would drive investment from those $40 billion into renewables, energy efficiency, and so forth. Because that's the public policy of the state of Illinois. We believe that is good for the people of Illinois to drive those investments. That's what the $40 billion in operating budget we hope we'll be doing more of. And at the exact same time, the tens of billions of dollars in the pension funds are invested in the fossil fuel companies that the operating budget is trying to move away from. So we've got the left hand and the right hand. They don't only not know what each other are doing, they're acting based on totally different philosophies. The left hand, the operating budget, acting based on the question of what's good for the people of Illinois, and the right hand based on the question of only what do we think is going to bring investment returns, and they're undoing each other's work.
Oh, geez.
Now that can't be the best way to handle this question. And that feeling that there's got to be a better way is what got us to start talking and thinking and writing, and Ameya has a lot more to add to that. So, stand over here and listen.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a while since we've sort of shared a stage before. So a couple of years now. So
better circumstance.
Better circumstances, yes. So how many of you have seen the movie Wall Street?
Oh, yeah.
Gordon Gekko wants to buy Blue Star Airlines, bust unions, lay people off so he can strip the company off and sell it for spare parts. That's activist investing, right? And there are real actors in the markets who do that right now. Carl Icahn is one of them. Bruce Rauner was one of the most prolific activist investors. So there's this thing that we talk about, the fiduciary responsibility of companies, right? That their sole purpose is to generate profit for their shareholders. The problem with that is, imagine a pension fund investing in a company. That company busts unions and offshores jobs to generate returns for pension funds who are union employees.
It makes no sense.
It makes no sense to do that. And this has happened over the last 40 years. And this is, so the underlying logic of the fiduciary responsibility is that you generate returns and profits no matter the cost. And if the incentive for CEOs is to gin up returns quarter to quarter, well then the path of least resistance is usually laying people off, scrapping the company for spare parts at times, offshoring jobs. When the incentives are structured that way, because we as shareholders, or in many ways over the last 40 years, there aren't that many individual shareholders. Less than half, just over half of Americans own individual shares. So what's happened over the last 40 years, as this trend of busting unions and all these other activities to gin up profits has sort of gone up, individual ownership of shares has gone down. And so we've created policymakers out of institutional funds, right? Because those same companies who don't want to pay taxes, who want to bust unions to generate profits, are the same companies that hire expensive lobbyists to make sure they don't have to pay their fair share in taxes. So who's the policymaker? People or the shareholder? So, and that's not to say that shareholders are bad, all of them, or that it's just challenging the underlying logic that we all bought into, which is a company's sole purpose just to create profit, no matter the cost to society? Because there isn't a single human institution that teaches us to be permanently greedy or selfish or self-absorbed because an invisible hand is going to take care of everything. No parent would teach their child to be greedy and selfish and just behave that way because all the other kids are being taught to be greedy and selfish. And if every child is greedy and selfish, then an invisible hand is going to make things equitable for everyone. That's crazy. But yet that is the underlying logic of economics, of the Chicago School of Economics, when we all fell for it. So the question is, how do we then rethink this, right? And so how do we make sure that our investments are aligned with our priorities? So for just quick perspective, when you think about the Green New Deal and you have people who are opposed to it on the left and the right, or the center left and right, who say that this is not financeable, it's $16 trillion, it's just too expensive, Well, if you just add up state and local pension funds, you're talking about $4+ trillion. So imagine if you could just bond against that, that's $40 trillion. So you can finance the Green New Deal 2+ times over if we simply decided that we wanted to use our money to finance the things that we care about. So I think, kind of getting back, we'll get back more into the weeds, I think, kind of think about it up here, and in the weeds and then think about it up here, is to say, we bought into a logic that allows this idea that profits, no matter the cost, is what should drive pension investments. That profits, no matter the cost, should drive institutional and even sort of the more retail investors and how they make decisions. And this is how we've gotten to a place, look who's in the White House, right? If you have companies seeking short-term gains at the expense of communities over 2, 3, 4 generations, then it shouldn't be a surprise to us that Donald Trump is in the White House. He is the natural result of this kind of economics. And so I think it is important for us, and this is kind of what we're going to be thinking about, is challenging this notion. And by the way, if we would have said this probably 10 weeks ago, you would have said, you're rabid lefties. I think we probably are. But I think the critics would have said that. What's interesting is the Business Roundtable just put out a similar statement. They didn't go this far, but they basically said the sole purpose of a corporation should not just be to generate profits. This is Jamie Dimon. So what I'm saying is these are the biggest corporations and the CEO saying, there's a crack in capitalism, in the system. And if you want it to survive, then something needs to change. Now, the good news of that is, this can't just be a PR move. We can't allow them just to make this a PR move. So it's important to match that rhetoric that's coming out of Jamie Dimon and some of the banks who have helped destroy parts of the economy and communities around the country, and hold them accountable and say, okay, so if it's not just about profit, then why can't you divest from building pipelines or private prisons or immigrant detention centers? That's on the banking side. On our pension funds, this is our money. It should not be going into investments that destroy the health of our neighbors or the long-term viability of our communities, or more importantly, long-term survival of human beings, right? So there is a really interesting opportunity here. The problem is, you're talking about pension funds, actuarial results, you're getting into what people will say is complicated math, but really in my mind, it's like, we got to stop allowing economists from using math to justify their wretched politics, and then convince us that we don't know any better and that they know more than we do because we don't know the same math or we take the same classes they do. So there is an opportunity to go big. This is why the Green New Deal is really important. And we have the money to do this. The question is, can we mobilize it? And I think there's incredible opportunity at the local level to go and talk to your trustees about what are we doing at the county and local level about our pensions? Where are those dollars going? Do we have ESG principles in place, et cetera, et cetera? So, Daniel, you want to kind of take over?
Not really.
No?
Amanda, should we take a few questions?
Yeah, I think it'd be a great time for questions. Yep.
So I'm on Naperville City Council, and we are talking just at our last meeting last night. We brought up in new business that some of the police and fire pensions, there's a bill in the state to get a lot of the smaller municipalities outside of Chicago together, so that there's just one person or group who is managing all of the pensions for all of the municipalities for police and fire. The idea is we'll save a ton of money because because we won't all have to hire all these people to manage this money, whatever. So my question for you is, on this specifically is, you know, is there something at the state, are you guys talking about legislation that would, and especially if we make this move, I mean, I want those bills to kind of be put somewhere together on if you're gonna manage, if only one group is gonna manage all the police pensions, then we also want to make sure that they are managed in this specific way under these guidelines. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and I just wanna, I think your question is so on point. I wanna make sure everyone is kind of on the same page. Is everyone aware of this fire police pension consolidation question? So, okay, some yeses, some no's. So, if you're a teacher outside of Chicago, it doesn't matter if you teach in Naperville or Downers Grove or Evanston where I live, or Cairo in the southern tip of the state, you're in one giant pension fund. It's called the Teachers Retirement System. If you're a municipal employee, whether you work in this building or for the Evanston Park District where I live, or for a library downstate, you're in a single pension fund. It's called the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. And the idea is these are big pension funds, and they're relatively efficient because there's just a few of them and a lot of money in them, and they can be professionally run and it should be cheaper. If you're a police officer or a firefighter, that's not true. Every city pretty much has its own pension fund for its firefighters, and then separately its own pension fund for its cops. And that's not how most states do it. Pennsylvania is basically the only other state that does anything remotely like this. And so I got interested in this when I was a legislator. And at the time, I think there were 11 municipalities in my district. So there was like practically a couple dozen different pension funds. And I started calling them up. Each of these pensions is run by a board of 5 people. I started calling them up and asking, hey, when's the next meeting of your pension board? Can I come? And the first red flag was their response was, well, why do you want to come? Which is kind of an alarming thing for what's supposed to be an open public meeting. But, they eventually told me, and I would go like in the morning to, the Winnetka Fire Pension Board meeting, and then in the afternoon, after the lunch break, I'd go to the Glenview Police Pension Board meeting. And at the first board meeting, there'd be a legal consultant and an investment consultant and an accounting consultant. And then I'd get to the second meeting and realize that we all should have carpooled together. Because it was the same, these little cottage industries of these companies that got their teeth into all these different municipal pensions. They're sucking money, depending on how you think about it, either out of the public's pocket or out of the firefighters and cops' pockets. Either way, not a great situation. So the idea to merge these pension funds is precisely to solve that problem. And I think if you do it right, it will definitely save money over time. But you're exactly right. In so doing, you're going to create another meaningful pool of money that will then be invested, maybe in a way that's consistent with the values of the people of Illinois, or maybe in a way that's adverse to the values of the people of Illinois. And so it's another chance to use some of this money to put it to work to do some good. And the fact that they're potentially creating that pool is an incredibly timely opportunity for us to have this conversation. So I think it is a perfect moment to say, okay, we're going to create this new pool of money. Let's now lay out some potential rules of the road about where it ought to go and what types of investments are consistent with the state's values and what types of investments should be avoided because they're effectively undoing what the rest of the state government is doing. I will say that was not the focus of the task force that came out with this recommendation, so we've still got some work to do to get it on the table, but they've still got some work to do to pass the bill, so we might be able to do our work fast enough.
I just like it, because of the timing, I know that we're being asked to sign as a council,
Right.
sign a letter to go to the state to say, yeah, we like this idea. And I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to say, that's all,
I think the answer to that question is absolutely yes, and the way I would structure that letter, respectfully, is to acknowledge that this is creating an entity that's very similar to one you already deal with, IMRF, and now I'm like wordsmithing on stage, which is one of the biggest mistakes a human being can do. But I would maybe say, listen, we've been thinking about the ways in which IMRF's investments have kind of been on autopilot, and recognize that's difficult to change. We support changing that, but by the way, the creation of a new thing is a unique opportunity to get it right without having to unwind a bunch of stuff. And so that sets the table to then come back and have the fight about IMRF, which we absolutely should have. It also explains that you got it right in the first, when you first set it up.
And I just want to add one thing. The thing we don't talk about often is it's the cottage industry that we've created for pension and investment consultants. But then you also, how they make their money, or where they place those dollars and how then those funds make money also needs to be closely scrutinized, right? So like a lot of these funds that are actively managed will charge you 1 or 2% every year. And it sounds like a small number, but over 10 years, it's 20% of your principal compounded. So, if you're talking about over 30 years, you're literally giving away more than 1/3 of your principal. That's a lot of money. And so, to me, like one of the things I've been thinking about recently is, everyone talks about the funding crisis for pensions, but some of it might actually, and I don't know if the math bears up, maybe it does, could be rooted in just the amount of fees that we pay, right? Like returns are obviously, we're not always beating the market. And so I just think there is a better way to invest. Sometimes it is more passive investments. And this isn't me, this is Warren Buffett talking, right? Who's basically said this, that these hedge funds cannot beat the market, and often don't, and they might get lucky here and there, but they don't have a really good track record, so.
Bruce?
What is, I love the ends. I am not skeptical, cautious, because I am open-minded and optimistic, but I'm cautious about the means. When W was president and the Republicans were calling the shots, they used a lot of tax credits and things like green energy to move, so you have 2 gallons of gasoline are used to generate 1 gallon of biofuel. This is kind of like a center-left supply side solution, and I like the thinking. But how do you avoid putting too much money into maybe green technologies that the market isn't quite there yet to support the investment? How do you legislate that so you don't get into a point where a situation where too much money is going into a sector of the economy that's not ready for that much investment?
I think you've got to be careful about a lot of stuff if you want to operationalize this. One thing where I thought you were going with W, and maybe you were partially, is
Social Security.
Well, great point too, but I just mean something even simpler. You don't want pension investments to be a kind of political football where every time there's a new election, the values advanced by the pension investments will flip. And then, one day a Republican wins and all of a sudden they're just invested in, pregnancy crisis centers and so forth, right? You got to be very careful about what you mean. And part of what we're talking about is to be really strategic about using the entire pool of money as a single resource, right? Not just one pension fund here does this and some different pension fund there does the opposite, but let's get that $4 trillion pool of money acting in concert. And there's a lot of work being done in, for example, what's called the ESG field, environmental, social, and governance, of rigorous, sober analysis that says, listen, when we analyze an investment, we shouldn't ignore the environmental consequences, because by the way, the environmental consequences could well have fiscal consequences, given what global warming is likely to do. We shouldn't ignore the social consequences, and we shouldn't ignore the governance consequences, which is to say, if we invest in companies that are irresponsibly and poorly governed, we're essentially investing in the creation of a long-term crisis. And so, to me, the end state of this is not so much, gosh, I really hope the governor of Nebraska has values that align with Ameya's in mind. The end state is, let's have a rigorous system, establish real national standards, real analysis and assessment, and then make sure that these pension investment decisions are being kind of pushed through that sieve, because that's the right way to make the long-term decision that's also fiscally sound.
And I think on a mechanism, from a mechanism standpoint, I think, I believe strongly in the public option, right? A public option for investment banking or banking, right? So like, imagine We have a 529, right, that the state, although it's a public option for college savings, the investment vehicles, I think there's still more scrutiny there. It's the same kind of scrutiny that needs to be applied to what we just talked about. But if you're thinking about a public entity that would then invest on behalf of the public, trained investment bankers that are seeking returns that align with the values of these stated principles, right? That, we're not going to invest in companies that bust unions. We're not going to invest in companies that harm the environment, or, there are some basic principles that we can put in place. And I think a public option wouldn't be a bad idea, right? California, just last week, the governor of California signed a bill allowing cities to create public banks, right? What would a public bank do? I mean, it doesn't replace banks. It creates competition in the marketplace, which, if you're a capitalist, would make the market more efficient. Yet, banks don't want public options, right? So it's the same thing on the investment side. They come every time. The people who are going to crow the loudest about this pension consolidation are the folks who are making money off of it.
Yeah.
And so part of that is recognizing where the incentive structure is, and perhaps thinking maybe there's a public way to do this, a public-facing entity that could do this on our behalf.
Max? Do you recognize any downsides to social investing?
Downside.
I think it raises a lot of really hard questions. And to me, I think if those questions are answered carefully and responsibly before you enter into it, I don't think so. But I think if you just do it willy-nilly without caution, then I think there are significant financial risks to it, along with just sort of, operational risks, where again, if every time there's an election, the investment strategy flips 180 degrees, that's a really, really bad way to run a pension fund. So I think you gotta grapple with these questions in advance about what your principles are, what it means to invest consistent with your values. You need to put that in writing and adopt long-term policies. And I think if you do that properly, you've mitigated the risks that I would be concerned about.
And there's 20 people in this room?
Ballpark.
If you were to establish a social construct for an investment vehicle for these 20 people, and this is a progressive group, you probably couldn't even get unanimity on Colt's AR-45, AR-15, or the drug RU-46. You can't get group buy-in when you identify value in the investment package.
So I want to push back on that, because I think the purpose of democracy and government and governance is to take the disparate views of a large number of people and produce enough of a consensus to allow you to move forward. And I actually, on that score, don't see a meaningful distinction between the policy debates around, for instance, contraception, as you talk about RU-46, or the investment decisions related to contraception. I think that if you are confident in the tools of democracy to enable yourself to address them in the one sphere, then you ought to be confident in the tools of democracy to allow you to address them just as well in the other sphere. And the thing that I don't understand is this theory of, over here we make these political decisions all the time, every 5 minutes, it's no problem, we make them, we unmake them, it's just how democracy works. And over here we're not allowed to even ask the question. That bright line, to me, does not make sense.
The bright line does make sense, because the purpose over on this side is to generate funds. It's to close the gap that the state of Illinois has. It's to generate revenue. On the other side of the line, you're not generating revenue at all.
I would challenge that as well. First of all, on the other side of the line, of course, you've got your entire tax system to discuss, which is definitely about generating revenue. Second of all, I don't know what it's like in the city council. I couldn't walk around the state capitol for more than 2.5 minutes before some advocate for some budgetary priority would stick a fact sheet in my hand that didn't say, hey, Daniel, vote for early child care because it's a nice thing for families to have. It would say vote for early childhood education because because $1 put in early childhood education returns $7 on the back end. And in fact, these kinds of return considerations are brought into the budgeting conversation every day of the week. So that distinction, I think, is artificial.
And so, and if I may, the thing here is also,
Is it something we said?
yeah.
100% my fault, I apologize. We're now into the ghost story portion of the evening.
Halloween.
Did we ask the wrong question?
No, I gave the wrong answer.
Diane knows where to go. I'm going to speak just a moment here, and I love my sheet here, but when I was putting together some publicity for this event tonight, I thought, I need to know more about socially responsible investments, and that ESG score intrigued me. Now, I have my personal investments with Fidelity, and I've got like 13, 14 mutual funds, and every now and then I change up one or whatever, and I've got all the sectors covered, and I'm trying to be responsible. But to be honest, I really don't know what's in all those funds. I really don't know. So I
Even
thought,
the individual company, they buy each other twice a week.
well, now hold on. What I did though, I looked at socially responsible funds at Fidelity. There are 5 of them that I found, and the first one is an index fund, an domestic index fund, and it's got a return year to date of 20.04%, which competes very favorably with anything I currently own. There's a bond index fund as well that was within, I think, 2,500th point of what I currently have. I've got a bond index fund as well. I think there's an assumption that if you invest socially responsibly, that you're going to sacrifice return. And honestly, that's not what I found at Fidelity. And I called up their 800 number. I said, tell me how these funds have performed. And there's 5 of them. One of them was formed only in May, and it highlights companies that are promoting women to a great extent. They're on their board in great numbers, maybe over half their board. But those are the prisms through which they look for companies. And that ESG score, what did he say?
He's coming.
Oh, okay. That ESG score, that, you want to explain it? I can't. Well, maybe I can see
So,
it.
I mean, here's
Oh,
thank you. Here's one way to think about it.
This is what happens when Ameya starts talking.
Yeah.
Actually, let me finish this one thing, because that's a great explanation for it. The environmental issues, climate change, carbon emissions, air, water pollution, energy efficiency. That's the environmental score. On social issues, it's labor standards, supply chain management, health and safety, gender diversity. Under governance issue, board and executive compensation. You know the president of Pfizer gets almost $27 million? I have a letter to the editor I sent, and I have to look him up. Lobbying, business ethics, political contributions. That's your governance score. That's ESG. Every one of those 5 funds has an interesting mix and a focus, but not any of them are sacrificing return. They were all fabulous. I mean, I was really impressed. The Fidelity Women's Leadership Fund, it's only got a 2% return so far, but it just started in May. And what do they say? It's a large cap exposure involving companies that include a woman as part of a senior manager team, a board composed of at least 1/3 of women, and in the fund manager's opinion, policies that attract, retain, and promote women. I've never seen a fund like that. So you know what? I haven't called up Vito yet, but I think Vito's getting a call. And I think one of those 13 funds is going to go someplace new. I'm going to try it out. Because honestly, I have no idea. I've got a lot of technology funds. What's in there? You know, you see Apple, and okay, that looks like a good
And were you in
return.
the legislature when someone made the case and investment within our pension structures all had to divest of Sudan?
I believe I was there then, or else it was shortly before I got there.
They ultimately, that crashed.
Yeah.
It proved to be just absolutely unmanageable from the pension systems, because pensions are managed against indexes. And the problem is, it takes millions of dollars in a period of time to generate an index. And there were no indexes minus Sudan.
Right, and that's why I think it is so, I think both the feasibility of what we're talking about and also the efficacy of what we're talking about relies on not just asking one pension fund to do one thing, but using the fact that you're talking about a giant pool of $4.5 trillion, enough money to fundamentally change markets, and then asking that pool of money to move as one. And that's enough to, for example, create a new index. I want to tell a sort of funny story about this. Your view is totally reasonable.
Max, you should share your leadership positions with IMRF.
Spent 11 years on their board.
And he was chair for how many years? Weren't you the chair too?
A couple of different times.
Mm-hmm.
That is a lot of service. Thank you. It's a mainstream position. I was talking to an economist who specializes in pensions, who was like really going after me on this, and she made a point that there had been a recent study that had come out about pension funds that have a set aside from their investment portfolio that they invest specifically in their own state, right? Because the idea is, hey, we've got all this money, we might as well put it to work here and creating jobs at home. And she said there was a whole study that came out about these special directed investments. And I said, and what did you learn? And she said, it was terrible. We learned they did better than the rest of the investments. And the truth is that if you think about this question properly, you don't have to sacrifice return. If you think about it sloppily, you may well sacrifice return. That's something that I don't think we can afford to do. I'll say one more thing, and then I know Ameya wants to add to this. If you're an individual investor dealing with your own, let's say 401k or your own IRA, you may feel strongly about labor standards. And so you may just feel like the right thing for you to do with your money is invest in a fund that doesn't invest in companies that have bad labor standards. That's a choice for you to make based upon your own values and your own priorities and your own assessments of the investment options.
If you can figure out who's who.
But if you're a pension fund, it's a different ballgame.
Yeah.
Let me explain why. If you're a pension fund, you're relying on next year's tax revenue to put more money in your bank account, and the year after's tax revenue, and the year after's tax revenue again. If you are, in the name of return, investing in businesses that destroy jobs in your own state, you're cannibalizing next year's tax revenue. And so I think the self-interest, the self-financial interest of a pension fund is fundamentally different because they need the economy to be going well next year and next decade and even next century. I think that's important to bring to this conversation as well.
Ameya, do you have another remark?
Just quickly, yeah,
Fair tax?
and just on that, that's a really important point, but I think it goes back, I think one thing we all as people need to decide is the need for narrative change around this. Like, why are we so transfixed on this idea that that somehow working against the common good equals the common good? That perhaps there are ways to make large-scale investments in infrastructure, like the Green New Deal suggests, that could also generate significant returns and create a multiplier effect, a generational multiplier effect. I say all this because part of it is we've bought this hook, line, and sinker from the investment banking world that there is only one way to think about economics. And as history now shows us over the last 40 years, they've been wrong about everything. Pseudoscience in some ways.
In that roundtable letter that came out over the summer, did they suggest another way to measure? When they said it's not just return on for shareholders, maximizing the profit for shareholders, it could be, they just said it shouldn't be that, it should be something broader than that?
I mean, not at a high level of detail, certainly. It wasn't let's move from this model to that model. It was let's acknowledge that these things need to be a part of the consideration.
And what things did they say?
We should care about workers, that we should care about our communities, that we care about creating American jobs. Very, general statements, it's fine. But that's where matching their rhetoric with action is important.